November 13th when it travels to Uniondale, New York to face the Long Island Nets. Head over to the Cross Insurance Arena. The Maine Mariners were ambushed by 4 first-period goals and couldn't rally back against the Newfoundland Growlers on Saturday night. The Growlers completed a weekend road sweep in Maine and extended their point streak to 8 games to open the season. That was your Big Jeff Sports Flash. I'm Taylor MANNIX.
Grasp on the English language in general.
Filibuster with Jeff Manning.
Filibuster?
It is.
We're on the radio.
5-star rating, or would you be a liar? It's Taylor Manning.
Or would you be a liar? That's awesome.
I don't know. Your brother is prime rating.
Call 207-775-2217 or 1-866-811-9505.
Good guy, my friend. I mean, brother is French.
Brother
I
is
don't know why I
French.
know that. I did 4 years of Spanish. You know hermano? Hermano is brother. As in, hey, hermano.
Hey, hermano.
And Mannix begins now. Here's Jeff and Taylor.
You are going to fail and bomb and gag and fail and bomb.
Yalla. Let's go. Good afternoon. Welcome into the last hour of this Mannix Monday edition of Middays with Mannix and Mannix. Jeff and Taylor with you, and we'll start our final hour as we always do on a Monday. We're talking college football. Former college football coach Malik Hall is also the host of the Catch Up with Coach podcast. Coach, how you doing?
Hello, hot coffee. I'll tell you what a weekend. Everybody you thought should have held the line, dropped the line.
I tell you, I know. What a crazy week in college football. I just feel like we kind of are saying that every Monday when we bring you on, but I suppose we need to start with a marquee matchup in Athens, Georgia, between the new number 1 ranked team in the first release of the college football playoff ranking, the Tennessee Volunteers, taking on the defending national champions, Georgia, who were number 3 in that opening ranking. And as I said earlier in the show, I don't know why I forget that the Georgia Bulldogs basically have an NFL defense practically anytime they play somebody tough. But they practically have an NFL defense, and they won pretty easily there at home. Tell us your thoughts there in seeing the Dogs take it to the Vols.
You know, I picked the Vols. I think America wanted the Vols to get it done because – you know, old Rocky Mountain Top, it hasn't been what it once was. The old Josh Heupel, who was a Heisman candidate, nostalgic was playing a big part of the wanting for the Vols to be there. And if they were going to be there, the first test was Alabama, which had me even thinking that they may be able to go in there and give Georgia some smoke. But unfortunately, from the time that Georgia made their first mistake, they didn't make another one. And the most interesting thing about this game to me, on the outside looking in, you know, Tennessee had enough weapons. But there's a time and a place, you know what I mean? And so what I don't think Tennessee did a great job with is managing the atmosphere that's in Athens. They're not home. And letting the crowd get a handle of them. And the first 3 touchdowns were big plays by Georgia, which, you know, the first touchdown was 1-play touchdown. The second touchdown was 4 plays touchdown. And so it put Tennessee in a position where the game was almost, you felt like the game was getting out of hand because Tennessee, one, couldn't get any first downs. Every drive that they had, they punted. And then when they had to try to push the ball downfield, it turned out to be an interception. So it was just like nothing could go right for Tennessee. They couldn't stop the bleeding. No one on defense could stop what Georgia was bringing to the table, which is a balanced attack if you haven't seen one. And when they go up top, it was almost like, oh, boy, here we go. And that was not a good feeling if you're a coach and if you are Tennessee. You know, I would say I was a Tennessee ambassador at this point. But, yeah, Georgia is the Bulldog. And right now they are top dog, period.
Yeah, I was going to say they've only allowed 97 points allowed, the lowest in the SEC. The next closest that I looked at was actually 165 given up by Alabama. So, I mean, that's just gives you a little bit of a grasp of how much better the Bulldogs defense has been than everybody else, even in the SEC. And keeping it on the SEC, speaking of Bama, LSU now atop the SEC West after that big-time overtime victory. They're 5-1 in conference, 7-2. Bama 7-2. Ole Miss 8-1. What are we looking at for the SEC West now? Obviously, I think the East is solidified. It's Georgia. Georgia will probably represent them unless they stumble in the East. But the West now with LSU, Ole Miss, and Bama, I mean, what do we make of that, Malik? It seems like it's just a mess now.
This is where it's go really cookie noodle. Let's say Georgia loses the SEC title game.
Yeah, right. No,
Like it's one of those deals where, like, in theory, the only SEC team that should go to the playoffs should be Georgia, barring that they take care of business. It's the old adage: if everyone takes care of business, we don't have any problems. We don't have any controversy. You know, Michigan, Ohio State will sort itself because they have to play each other. And so whoever loses there puts the Big 12 in a good position to go slot right in for the fourth spot. And potentially now you got the Pac-12. I know you're a big Pac-12 guy, Tay. So, like, in my mind, if everybody takes care of business and whoever comes out the East to play in the title game, whoever comes out the West to play in the title game, I don't see them beating. The one team that I think we all think can always catch Georgia is Alabama, but does Alabama even get to go to the title game at this point? With Tennessee having, even though they're not in their conference, I don't know how the West is going to shake, Tay. I just don't know. Big picture, if the West beats Georgia, being that they should go, now we have a whole different kind of controversy and conversation.
Yeah, no kidding. What do you make of Brian Kelly's decision to go for 2 in overtime? It was a gutsy decision, but it paid off.
You know, look, I remember we've had these conversations about coaches that go for 2. Listen, if you can get it done with the one play you have, the one bullet, let's get it done. I think that speaks to the confidence that he had in his ball club. I would even argue that was a conversation on the sideline with the major players in the game, the quarterback, maybe the running back, lineman, maybe, like, coach, let's go for it. And talk about coming up with it. And they did. And being like, okay, we either going into another overtime. Now, can we get them in the second overtime, or do we have them? Do we got the one play? Can we hit them and get in, get out? And they did. And me personally, I would always love to be in a situation one and done, because those are the kind of situations you drill. You can't drill, okay, we kicked the field goal, now let's go into a second overtime. Like, generally, you got a package for one set of overtime plays. After the first set, you recycling plays throughout the game. You're putting players in that may not be ready for that type of stage. So if you got an opportunity to get them, and they got them.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, and this weekend was pretty crazy. I mean, just looking at everything. And for me, I will say, because I love TCU, seeing them in the top 4, I know that they're probably the biggest fraud, arguably, in that one. They might not have a good chance. But what do you make of them hopping now in the top 4 and their chances of staying there if they win out?
I think TCU and TCU does not have an easy out to win. I mean, all things considered, they've been getting it done, and it hasn't been easy already. So in my mind, if they get it done, they went out, and I thought Texas Tech had them on the ropes. I watched that game. But look, TCU still has to play Texas, who was ranked. If they beat Texas, that should give them a shoe in. They still have to beat Baylor. Even though Baylor isn't ranked, we know Baylor is a formidable opponent. And then they got to finish out with right. And now they got to finish out with the Iowa State University, who loves upsetting people, right? And so I'm saying if TCU can win out, they're a shoe in. They're locked. and that keeps that second SEC team out of the conversation if TCU can hold their line. If TCU drops this ball and loses one of those games, now the debate is on for who's the next best opponent to be in the playoffs. Because TCU drop a loss, they not gonna just drop a few slots. Like you said, everyone thinks they're a fraud of the conversation. They drop one, they go drop out of the conversation completely.
Well, speaking of teams that dropped out of the conversation this week, the Clemson Tigers going to Notre Dame as the number 4 ranked team in the country against 3-loss Fighting Irish and getting blown off the field. They didn't even score until the 4th quarter. We don't have to worry about making the playoff anymore, do we?
Again, you shouldn't. Who's really probably, who really is just hot right now? Syracuse. Syracuse has to be burning red and Wake. 2 reasons, because those games, those were games that were going to be defining moments for their program. And unfortunately, they both have dropped games after losing those games and going into those games undefeated with the idea Clemson is going to lose again. But who would have thought it? It would be Notre Dame. Notre Dame is kind of in this position where they've gotten everybody that you did not expect them to get, and it's all happened after that embarrassing loss to Marshall, if you will. And so they got Syracuse. They just beat the number 14 Clemson. And so again, Jeff, if TCU doesn't mess this up, the ACC is out. Right? The only way the ACC gets back in this conversation is if the Big 12 drops its ball or the Pac-12, and that's including Oregon in that space.
And we can stick with the Pac-12 there, because I think the bigger question I should ask now, since we have Oregon and USC at 8 and 9, both taking care of business, USC barely, and then Oregon just blowing out Colorado. But if we are only going to have one conference in ACC champ or Pac-12 champ, it's got to be the Pac-12 champ at this point now, isn't it?
Yeah, that you would hope. I love Oregon. Oregon's path to this, they still have to play a Washington, a Utah, and Oregon State. Yes, if they take care of business, is a Pac-12 over an ACC opponent or ACC team at this point. But again, in my estimate, the Big 12 is the levying conference for that conversation, Jeff. And so if Oregon handles it, USC is out, Oregon's in. You got Oregon representing the Pac-12, TCU, the Big 12, the Big 10 winner, and then your SEC winner. And that leaves the ACC on the outs. But I'm saying, because the only undefeated teams are the Big 12 team, taking Georgia out of that equation, the TCU, the Michigan, and the Ohio State game that has to occur. And so that all will come to a head, and you figure TCU is the only one that I feel like, hey, they're in control because they've collided. They beat Texas. They control their own destiny. And so Oregon is in the same position TCU is in. If TCU drops it, everyone's going to talk about someone going in front of Oregon.
Yeah, well, and especially if you're at Oregon, because I'm looking at next week's matchup, which is kind of where I wanted to steer a little bit, talk about who's maybe in jeopardy. Oregon, who needs to win out, they're at Washington, who just knocked off number 24 Oregon State this past weekend. You mentioned TCU is at Texas, and again, I should say Washington has to come to Oregon, so staying in Eugene will probably help. But TCU has to travel over to Memorial Stadium in Austin, Texas. Georgia, Mississippi State, I think, that is what it is. I think we're all pretty confident in the way that Georgia's playing. But I am a little bit intrigued with the Alabama-Ole Miss game, because if Alabama gets knocked out, they're done in that. And I feel like with Ole Miss, it's the same thing. Both those teams, I do think, can compete with LSU, depending how LSU does. LSU, I think, has the easier schedule of them. But, what do you make of this week into this week just with some of those matchups that we.
You hit it on the nose. Like I think the Alabama Ole Miss game, they're fighting for the slip up that could happen in the Big 12 or the Pac-12. And so, with the one loss, like Ole Miss legitimately can say, look, we should be ranked higher than Alabama. Like, they have 2 losses. Right? How are they higher than us? Right? Well, all of that and Lane Kiffin is go juice that thing now. He's pumping all of those kind of conversations. All of rubber will hit the road this weekend, and with Alabama with 2 losses is still like in the top 10. Like, how is that even happening? Because it's Alabama. Now, Ole Miss beats Alabama. You now talking, is Ole Miss back in this conversation? And I still
they're 8-1. Like, they'll be a 1-loss SEC team.
Right. So now you're figuring, okay, this goes back to it again. I hate to say it. That TCU Texas game. TCU Texas is going to dictate how, and if whatever happens with Alabama Ole Miss, if TCU doesn't drop, those rankings don't change. And so, and then I'm going to say it because until we get to Ohio State, Michigan is on upset alert. Like, period. Like, I know it's not the most, like,
I got to ask this, because I'm looking at this scenario right now. I'm looking, this is a crazy scenario that I think is actually very possible, because let's say, because Ole Miss lost to LSU, so say Ole Miss wins this week and they win out. They end with 1 win.
Yep.
LSU will play Georgia in the SEC championship no matter what, though, because they have that tiebreaker despite LSU having 2 overall losses. They have the conference split with them. They'll obviously hold on to that with the win. If Ole Miss doesn't play in the SEC championship game, LSU loses their 3-loss team. We'll say Tennessee stumbles 1 more. Even if Ole Miss don't play an SEC championship game, when you have to consider them if they only are a 1-loss SEC team and that losses to LSU, I feel like this would get crazy if Ole Miss wins out, because they might not be playing in a championship game, but they'll have a better record than LSU, who played in the championship game, but it's just the way it ends up because they lost the regular season battle.
Man, listen, and that's all the controversy that, in my mind, only happens with losses outside the SEC. Like if those key teams don't lose outside the SEC, yeah, like Ole Miss still could win out, but it's not even relevant because of their ranking and the teams that did not lose prior to the national or national playoff contention. So, yeah, you're right, man. And this is all levied with how many ranked teams are in the SEC. Like, is why Alabama is not below Ole Miss right now. And here's the worst part. If they were, and they beat Ole Miss, let's say Ole Miss is 5, right? And Ole Miss beats, I know all these hypotheticals, you can get lost in a wormhole, right? But like now Alabama beats Ole Miss and they back in the conversation again. Is like, how many losses can Alabama take? It depends on who they beat that's ranked by the time they get to them after their losses. And so you're right. Ole Miss not being in the SEC title game is going to be a problem as far as Lane Kiffin's concerned. But it could very well happen. And I tell you this, Louisville, Louisville has to play Clemson. I'm going to tell Louisville ends up beating Clemson too, to solidify that there won't be an ACC team now.
Wow, something else right there here, that's for sure. Let's turn a little more local here. UMaine lost another close one at Rhode Island. Interestingly, though, as I look at the CAA standings, UNH football appears back. They're tied to the conference at 5-1, so don't like seeing that a couple weeks ahead of the Bryce Cal Muppets battle. And UNE went down this week, but obviously 5 wins for them. How about Hudson, too? They won 4 straight. They're now a 5-win team as well. How about that for Coach Nat Clark?
Coach Clark's a good man, and taking over the program from a legend. And so I love that he's got it going. You know, the CAA, man, like Maine losing a tight one to Rhode Island and UNH, they just lost. They were undefeated, they just lost to Richmond. And so now you have Rhode Island who's gonna come up to UNH to try to get a W. Like the CAA, you could end up having teams with 2 losses by the end of next week. And they all be
end up in the tournament.
And they all be tied for number 1. And so the CAA is the version of the SEC by way of FCS football, where like these teams are loaded and they'll get in the playoffs. They're going to be arguing for 4 teams in the playoff. And the teams that are going to be completely against it, one, the Patriot League, and you know, maybe the Northeast Conference. So it's going to be an interesting fallout. And like you said, you know, UNH still has to play Rhode Island and Maine. So and shout out to Coach Licton getting 5 wins in his 4th year of the program, already at the 500 mark, and just going to keep driving that program to the top of the conference. So and unfortunately my Blue Devils
I know.
Shout out to Coach Rassy, man, and the Lewiston Blue Devils community. Hey, we got an off season to reload it up and go for it next year. So
that was a great season and a great game from my understanding too. Just didn't go their way in the end.
It was a good one. So I think those guys are encouraged, the community is encouraged, and hey, we got some state finals that we're gonna be at too, Jeff. So I'm excited.
Yeah, that's exactly right. Just a couple weeks away from that here as well. Malik Hall, the host of the Catch Up with Coach podcast and a former college football coach. Thanks so much for joining us here once again. We'll do it again next Monday.
No problem. Keep it local, boys.
Keeping it local. That is right. We'll come right back. We'll open the phone lines for you next segment, and we'll open the Joe Bornstein box office this hour too. It's Middays with MANNIX and MANNIX. 96.3